Your love life isn't broken. It was shaped long before you had your first relationship. Why do you always choose the same type of person? Why do you cling to those who hurt you or run from those who genuinely care about you? What if the problem isn't in your adult decisions, but in how you learned to love in childhood? Today we're going to analyze the psychological signs that explain why your parents might have affected your capacity to love. Stick around, because this changes everything. You grew up with parents who were always on top of you. They didn't give you any real space to explore, make mistakes, or just be alone. Every decision was supervised, every emotion observed, every move controlled. On the surface, it looked like care. Deep down, it was a constant invasion of your emotional autonomy. When a child doesn't learn to separate safely, they develop the idea that closeness is fragile and that any distance can mean abandonment. That's how anxious attachment is born. Not because there's a lack of love, but because love never allowed for breathing room. The implicit message was clear. If I'm not close, something bad might happen. In adult life, this pattern activates without you even noticing. You analyze messages, response times, tiny changes in tone. A late reply isn't just a late reply, it's a threat. A brief silence turns into a danger signal. Not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because your nervous system learned to live on high alert. This type of attachment pushes you to constantly seek security. You need confirmation, presence, continuous proof of affection. And the more you seek them, the more pressure the other person feels. It's not a conscious choice, it's a learned reflex. Your body reacts before your reason. The paradox is painful. Parents who wanted to protect you ended up teaching you that love doesn't survive distance. And so, as an adult, you love with intensity, but also with fear. You cling not because you want to control, but because you're afraid to lose. This pattern doesn't make you weak or dependent. It makes you consistent with your history. But until you recognize it, you'll keep confusing closeness with security and distance with abandonment, even when they're not. Your father was there, but he wasn't really there. Maybe he lived in the same house, paid the bills and met his basic responsibilities, but emotionally he was inaccessible. He didn't ask how you felt, didn't validate your emotions, wasn't available when you needed him most. In other cases, he simply disappeared, physically or emotionally. The psychological result was the same. When a child learns that expressing emotional needs doesn't get a response, they develop a survival strategy to stop needing them. That's how avoidant attachment forms. Not because you don't want to love, but because loving was quickly associated with frustration or disappointment. In adulthood, this pattern clearly manifests. You're attracted to relationships, but when someone gets too close, something inside you activates. You feel discomfort, a loss of control, even suffocated. So you do what you learned. You withdraw. You become distant, ambiguous, or disappear without explanation. Not out of malice, but for self-protection. To others, this behavior is confusing. At first, you seem interested, present, even intense. Then, for no apparent reason, you grow cold. What's really happening is an internal conflict. A part of you desires connection, but another remembers that emotional dependence was never safe. The message learned in childhood was simple and devastating. Don't count on anyone. So when a relationship starts to matter, your nervous system interprets that importance as a threat. Pulling away isn't rejection, it's emotional regulation. The paradox is profound. You avoid attachment to prevent suffering, but that avoidance condemns you to superficial or unstable relationships. Not because you don't know how to love, but because you were never taught that someone could remain emotionally present without disappearing. From a very young age, you learned to take charge of things that weren't your responsibility. Maybe you took care of your siblings, calmed one of your parents, mediated conflicts, or took on emotional responsibilities that no child should have to bear. It wasn't a choice, It was an adaptation. Someone had to maintain balance, and that someone was you. This phenomenon is known as parentification. It happens when a child stops being cared for and becomes a caregiver. You learn that your value lay in being useful, solving problems, and being available to others. Your own needs took a back seat, not because they didn't exist, but because there was no room for them. In adult life, this pattern reproduces almost automatically. You become the emotional support for your partners. You listen, understand, help, and provide stability. You attract people who are broken, confused, or in crisis because you know exactly how to care for them. You don't consciously seek someone who needs saving, but your presence conveys a silent promise. I can handle this. The problem is that these relationships are rarely reciprocal. You give a lot, but receive little. Not because the other person is necessarily selfish, but because the dynamic was built on imbalance. You care, the other is cared for, and over time that burden becomes heavy. The most painful part is that many times you don't even know what you need. You're so used to tending to others' emotions that you've lost touch with your own. When someone asks you what you want, you draw a blank, not because you don't feel, but because you never learned to prioritize yourself. The paradox of the parentified child is cruel. You learn to love by caring, but no one taught you how to receive care. And so, in your adult relationships, you confuse love with responsibility and closeness with sacrifice, even when it leaves you emotionally exhausted. You grew up learning that your role was to keep the peace, avoid conflicts, ease tensions, anticipate others' moods. Maybe no one explicitly told you, but you understood very early on, if everyone else was okay, you were safe. That's how the emotional butler was born, that part of you that lives focused on others' needs and forgets its own. This pattern is known as people-pleasing or fawning behavior. It's not about genuine kindness, but a survival strategy. Saying yes became automatic. Adapting, giving in, silencing what bothered you seemed like the best way to maintain the connection. Expressing your own needs, on the other hand, felt dangerous. In adulthood, this is clearly reflected in your relationships. You adapt to the other person's tastes, accept dynamics that don't satisfy you, and avoid uncomfortable conversations to prevent tension. From the outside, you seem flexible and understanding. Inside, you slowly erase yourself. The cost appears over time. By not expressing boundaries or desires, frustration builds up. You start to feel invisible, undervalued, even used. But since you never showed who you truly were, the other person doesn't know anything is wrong. Disconnection happens in silence. The paradox of the emotional butler is that they do everything to be liked, but end up feeling alone. Not because they aren't appreciated, but because no one has had access to their inner world. The bond was built on the other person's comfort, not on your authenticity. You learned that love is maintained by serving, but that learning keeps you from relationships where you can be seen, heard, and chosen for who you are, without having to disappear to support the other person. You grew up in an environment where uncomfortable emotions had no real space. When something hurt, it was turned into a joke. When there was tension, the subject was changed. The message wasn't explicit, but you learned it just the same. Feeling too much was dangerous, and showing it even more so. That's how humor as an emotional armor was born. You learned to make people laugh to lighten the mood, to joke when things got serious, to transform discomfort into levity. From the outside, you seemed cheerful, witty, even charming. Inside, you were avoiding something much deeper, allowing yourself to feel and show what was really going on. In adulthood, this pattern becomes evident in your relationships. When the conversation starts touching on emotional topics, you respond with irony or jokes, not because you don't care, but because your system learned that emotional depth creates discomfort or rejection. Humor protects you, but it also distances you. People around you feel it's hard to get to you. They laugh with you, but they don't know how to connect with you. When they try to go deeper, they find an invisible barrier. They don't see sadness, fear, or vulnerability. Just a constant smile that doesn't change, even when something is wrong. The problem is that emotional connection needs authenticity. Laughing together creates closeness, but sharing pain creates intimacy. And when humor blocks any deeper emotion, the relationship stays on the surface. There's no conflict, but there's no true connection either. The paradox of the funhouse survivor is that they use laughter to keep from drowning, but end up isolated in their own role. The armor that protected them in childhood becomes a prison in adulthood. Not because you don't know how to feel, but because you were never taught that showing what you feel could be safe. From a very early age, you learned that love was earned by working for it, helping more, striving more, sacrificing more. Not because someone explicitly told you, but because it was the only way to feel valued. If you were useful, if you didn't bother anyone, if you carried responsibilities that weren't yours, then you deserved a place. This pattern is known as the Cinderella complex. You grew up believing that if you did enough for others, one day someone would come to rescue you, take care of you, give back everything you gave. But that day almost never comes, because the dynamic is built on imbalance. In adult life, this learning translates into relationships where you do 90% of the emotional work. You plan, support, understand, forgive. You adapt to the other's needs even when it means setting aside your own. Loving feels like a constant duty, not a shared space. The problem isn't your capacity to give, but that you don't know how to receive. When someone tries to care for you, it makes you uncomfortable. You don't know what to do with attention you didn't have to earn. You feel indebted, vulnerable, even guilty. So without realizing it, you push away those who could offer you a more balanced relationship. Instead, you stay with people who need saving, because there you know exactly what your role is. Giving feels safe, receiving doesn't. The paradox is that the more you give, the less you see yourself. Your value becomes tied to what you do, not who you are. This pattern isn't born from ego, but from lack. You learned that loving was serving. But until you question that idea, you'll remain trapped in relationships where effort replaces connection and sacrifice takes the place of genuine affection. Not everyone grew up in chaos. Some people had emotionally available parents, capable of offering support without controlling and closeness without invading. In that environment, love wasn't a bargaining chip or a reward for good behavior. It was constant, predictable, secure. That's where what psychology calls secure attachment comes from. Someone who develops this type of attachment learns from a young age that they can express what they feel without being rejected, that they can have needs without being humiliated, and that they can separate without losing the bond. They don't experience arguments as threats or distance as abandonment. The connection isn't questioned at the first conflict. In adult life, these people love differently. They don't chase, don't run away, and don't sacrifice themselves to be accepted. They communicate what they need, listen to what the other expresses, and trust that the bond can hold even through discomfort. For those who grew up in dysfunctional environments, this behavior can seem almost unreal. That's why they're called unicorns. But here's the important twist. Secure attachment isn't a fixed privilege or an unattainable condition. It's not something only inherited in childhood. It's a pattern that can be built with awareness, experience, and healthy relationships. The difference is that those who develop it as adults first had to identify and unlearn what they learned incorrectly. The common mistake is to think this type of love is boring or not intense enough. In reality, it's stable. It doesn't constantly trigger the alarm system. It doesn't confuse anxiety with passion or sacrifice with commitment. And that's why, for those who grew up in emotional disorder, it feels strange at first. The secure unicorn isn't someone perfect. It's someone who doesn't need to play games to be loved. And understanding that this model exists is the first step to stop repeating patterns that were never yours, but inherited. If you recognized one or more of these patterns, it doesn't mean you're condemned to repeat them. It means you can now see them. And seeing something clearly completely changes your relationship with it. Your way of loving didn't appear out of nowhere. It was a logical response to a specific emotional environment. It wasn't a personal flaw. It was an adaptation. Childhood wrote the first draft of your love life, but not the final one. Many behaviors that cause you pain in relationships today once protected you. They helped you survive, maintain connections, and feel safe. The problem is that what served you then might limit you now. Breaking these patterns doesn't mean blaming your parents or rewriting the past. It means understanding where you come from, so you can consciously choose where you're going. Attachment isn't a sentence. It's a structure that can be modified with awareness, inner work, and healthier relationships. The important question isn't what your parents did wrong, but what you are willing to do with what you learned. Because when you understand why you love the way you do, you stop repeating the story on autopilot and finally start writing a different one.